The letter arrived before the sun did, and by the time Eleanor Finch opened the front door, her hands were already shaking. The courier did not wait for a reply. He pressed the folded paper into her palm, turned his horse, and rode back into the fog, as if the house itself frightened him. Eleanor stood on the cold step in her nightclothes, staring at the name written across the front. It was not her married name. It was the name she had buried 3 years ago, the day she signed away her old life to become the wife of a duke she barely knew. She did not open it there. She folded it twice, pressed it flat against her chest, and walked back inside before anyone could see her face. 6 months earlier, Eleanor had been nobody of importance. She taught grammar and arithmetic to a 9-year-old girl named Lucy in a grand house that smelled of dust and unpaid bills. She had no fortune, no title, and no expectation that her life would ever change. Then the Duke of Merrow, a man named Vale Ashworth, walked into the schoolroom one afternoon and asked her to marry him. He did not kneel, he did not bring flowers. He stood in the doorway with his coat still buttoned from the cold outside, and he said the words the way a man reads a business contract aloud. "Marry me, Miss Finch, and your brother's debts disappear." Eleanor set down her chalk very slowly. She did not gasp, she did not blush. She simply looked at him the way she looked at a difficult sum, searching for the trick hidden inside it. "Which debts?" she asked. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps. Most women would have asked why. She had asked which. "All of them," he said. "Every last shilling your brother owes to men who do not forgive a late payment." Eleanor's stomach turned cold. She knew about Edward's debts. She had lain awake more nights than she could count, wondering how her brother had tangled himself so badly with men who collected what they were owed in ways that had nothing to do with courts of law. "Why me?" she said. "Because you already live in my house, because my daughter trusts you, because I need a wife who will not ask for love, and you, Miss Finch, do not strike me as a woman who believes in it." It was not a compliment. It was not meant to be, and yet it was, in its own strange way, the truest thing anyone had said to her in years. She thought of Edward, of the letters he no longer wrote because he was too ashamed, of the men who had begun asking around the village about where her family lived. She thought of her own small, careful life, built entirely on the hope that no one would ever need anything from her that she could not give. "I will need it in writing," she said. "Every debt named, every shilling accounted for." The Duke's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "You would make a fine solicitor, Miss Finch." "I would make a poor Duchess," she said, "but I imagine that suits you." It did suit him. That was the arrangement they built their marriage upon, brick by careful brick, with no room left over for anything as reckless as affection. They married 3 weeks later in a small stone chapel with 4 witnesses and a vicar who forgot the groom's middle name halfway through the ceremony. There was no crowd of well-wishers, no scattering of flowers. Eleanor wore a gray dress she already owned, because buying a new one for a marriage of convenience felt like a lie she was not willing to tell. Vale Ashworth slid a ring onto her finger and said his vows in the flat, steady voice of a man reciting an oath he had already decided not to feel. Eleanor said hers the same way. Afterward, there was no dancing, no toast raised in their honor. There was only a carriage ride back to Merrow House in silence, the two of them sitting across from one another, like strangers who happened to share a destination. "You will have your own rooms," the Duke said, staring out the window at the passing fields. "My daughter will call you her governess still, until she is old enough to understand what a stepmother is. I would ask you not to correct her." "I have no intention of correcting anything that keeps her steady," Eleanor said. He looked at her then, properly, for the first time since the wedding. Something in his expression shifted, the smallest crack in a wall built with great care. "Most women in your position would want the world to know they had become a duchess," he said. "Most women in my position did not marry for a ledger of unpaid debts," Eleanor replied. "I have no interest in announcing a transaction." He turned back to the window, and neither of them spoke again for the rest of the journey. Merrow House rose out of the mist like something out of an old story. Gray stone and tall windows, a place built for a family far larger and far happier than the one currently living inside it. Servants lined the entrance to greet their new Duchess, and Eleanor walked past each of them with the same composed nod she had once given visiting parents at the schoolroom door. Lucy was the only one who ran to her. "Are you really my new mama now?" the girl asked, tugging at Eleanor's sleeve, her eyes bright with a hope too large for the moment. Eleanor crouched down, ignoring the ache in her knees from 3 weeks of careful posture and careful silence. "I am still your teacher," she said gently, "and I will still read to you every night, exactly as I always have. Nothing important has changed." It was, of course, a small lie. Everything had changed. But some lies were kindnesses, and Eleanor had always been good at telling the kind that protected, rather than the kind that harmed. That night, alone in a bedroom larger than the entire cottage she had grown up in, Eleanor sat by the window and read Edward's last letter again, the one where he had begged her forgiveness without explaining what for. She had not understood it then, she understood it now, fully, sitting in a house that had been purchased, in part, with her own name. Down the hall she heard the faint sound of humming. 4 notes, repeated, stopping abruptly the moment a door closed somewhere else in the house. She did not know yet that it was her husband's habit, the small unconscious tune he hummed only when he believed himself completely alone. She would learn it in time, the way she would learn all his quiet, guarded pieces, one careful discovery at a time. For now, she only sat with the letter in her lap, listening to a stranger's house settle around her, and wondered what kind of woman she had just agreed to become. The next morning, the Duke found her already awake at the breakfast table, a cup of tea untouched in front of her, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. "You did not sleep," he said. "It was not a question." "I am not accustomed to large houses," Eleanor said. "They make too much noise settling." He sat down across from her, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. A footman poured coffee. Somewhere upstairs, Lucy's small footsteps thundered down a hallway, followed by the scolding voice of a nursemaid. "I have arranged for your brother's debts to be settled by the end of the week," the Duke said finally. "You need not concern yourself with the details." "I would like the details anyway," Eleanor said. He studied her for a moment, as though recalculating something. "Of course you would." He slid a folded paper across the table, a full accounting exactly as she had asked for on the day of his proposal. Eleanor read through it slowly, checking each figure, each name, the way she once checked a student's arithmetic for careless mistakes. When she finished, she folded it closed and set it beside her teacup. "Thank you," she said simply. "You do not need to thank me for honoring an agreement," the Duke said. "That is all this is, an agreement." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I am aware." And yet, even as she said it, something in her chest tightened in a way she did not have a name for, a small unfamiliar ache that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the way he had looked at her, just once, like she was more than the terms of a contract. She pushed the feeling aside before it could grow into something dangerous. A marriage built on convenience had no room for feelings that complicated its foundation. She had learned that lesson early in life, and she intended to keep learning it for as long as necessary. Outside the window, the fog was beginning to lift over the grounds of Merrow House, revealing gardens gone slightly wild from years of neglect, hedges overgrown, a fountain long since gone dry. It looked, Eleanor thought, exactly like the man she had married, grand on the outside and quietly falling apart underneath, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. She did not yet know that the letter waiting for her, months away, would force her to choose between the careful, guarded life she had built inside these walls and a truth she had spent years running from. For now, she only finished her tea, folded the accounting of her brother's debts into her sleeve, and went to find Lucy, because whatever else had changed, the girl still needed her lessons, and Eleanor still knew, better than anything else in the world, how to be steady for someone who needed her to be. It was the one thing about herself that marriage, convenience, or fear had not yet managed to take away. 3 months into the marriage, Eleanor learned the sound of her husband's footsteps well enough to know his mood before he entered a room. A slow, even step meant the estate accounts had balanced for once. A quick, clipped step meant a letter had arrived from London, usually bearing bad news about the tenant farms or the price of grain. And a long silence, followed by no footsteps at all, meant he had shut himself in his study and did not wish to be found. She learned this the way she learned everything, quietly, without asking, simply by paying attention. It was a skill she had built over years of teaching children who could not always say what troubled them. People rarely announced their true feelings out loud. They showed them in footsteps, in silences, in the small habits they thought no one else noticed. Vale Ashworth, she was beginning to understand, was a man made almost entirely of such habits. He hummed 4 notes, always the same 4, whenever he believed the house was empty. He stopped the instant he remembered he was not alone, as if caught doing something shameful. He read the same 3 pages of the newspaper every morning before moving to the rest, always the shipping reports first, though Eleanor could not imagine why a duke with no interest in the sea cared so much for which ships had come safely into port. She never asked him about it. She simply began taking her tea in his study in the afternoons, where the light was better for reading, and where, if he happened to walk in humming, she pretended very hard not to hear. He noticed the tea eventually. He noticed everything eventually, though he rarely said so directly. "You have claimed my study," he said one afternoon, standing in the doorway with a stack of letters under his arm. "The light is better here," Eleanor said, not looking up from her book. "You are welcome to claim it back, if you can find a room in this house with better windows." He did not claim it back. Instead, he began leaving the study door open in the mornings, a small unspoken invitation that Eleanor understood without needing it explained. Lucy noticed the change before either of the adults were willing to admit it existed. The girl had a talent, common to children who had lost too much too young, for reading the temperature of a room before anyone else in it. "You and Papa are not fighting anymore," she announced one evening, over a bowl of soup she was mostly ignoring in favor of studying Eleanor's face. "We were never fighting," Eleanor said. "You were being careful," Lucy said, with the terrible precision only a child can manage. "Now you are just being quiet together. That is different." Eleanor did not have an answer for that. She reached over and tucked a loose curl behind the girl's ear instead, the way she had done 100 times before Eleanor became a duchess, back when she was simply the woman paid to teach Lucy her letters. "Eat your soup," Eleanor said. "Quiet or not, you still need your supper." Lucy ate her soup, but she smiled the whole time she did it, as though she had won some private argument that Eleanor had not realized they were having. The household settled into its own rhythm after that. Eleanor oversaw the accounts alongside the housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Doyle, who had initially treated the new Duchess with the polite suspicion reserved for outsiders, but who had slowly warmed once she realized Eleanor had no interest in changing things simply to prove she could. Eleanor still taught Lucy her lessons each morning, though now she did so from a proper schoolroom desk with her own name carved discreetly into the corner, a small joke between herself and the estate carpenter, who had asked what to call her and received, for reasons she did not fully explain, her maiden name instead of her new title. Vale spent most days riding the tenant farms, returning each evening with mud on his boots and a tiredness in his shoulders that Eleanor recognized from her own years of never quite doing enough to fix a broken thing. The estate was recovering, slowly, the debts settled one by one, the fields showing their first real profit in years. He never spoke of it as a triumph. He spoke of it, when he spoke of it at all, as a debt finally being paid down, a wrong finally being corrected. Eleanor understood that feeling better than she let on. One evening in early autumn, over a dinner that had grown almost comfortable in its silences, Lucy set down her fork with the sudden gravity only a 9-year-old can summon. "What was my mother like?" she asked. The table went still. Vale's hand paused over his glass. Eleanor felt the question land somewhere deep in her chest, not because it was about Lucy's mother, but because she recognized the shape of it, the particular ache of a child asking for a piece of history no one wanted to hand her whole. "She had your laugh," Vale said finally, his voice careful, measured, a man walking across thin ice, one word at a time. "She laughed before the joke finished, always, could never wait for the ending." Lucy considered this with great seriousness. Did she like soup? "She hated soup," Vale said, and something in his face loosened just slightly, a memory surfacing that did not hurt quite as much as the others. "She thought it was a lazy meal, said real food should require a knife." Lucy laughed, delighted, and picked her spoon back up with new enthusiasm, as though her mother's opinion on soup had somehow been passed down and needed honoring. Eleanor said nothing through this exchange, but she watched Vale's face carefully, cataloging the way grief could sit so quietly beside love that the two became almost impossible to separate. Later, once Lucy had been sent up to bed, Eleanor found herself alone with Vale in the study. The fire burned low, the house settling into its nighttime silence around them. "You never speak of her," Eleanor said, "Lucy's mother." Vale did not look up from the papers in front of him. "There is little to say that would not simply make Lucy sad in a different way. Grief does not go away because it is not spoken of," Eleanor said. "It only learns to hide better." He looked up at her, then something sharp and searching in his expression. "You speak as though you know this from experience." Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly around her teacup. She thought of her mother, 3 years gone now, and the letter she had never fully answered, and the brother whose debts had bought her this very marriage. "I know a little of grief," she said, and left it there, offering no more than that single loaded sentence, because some doors were not meant to be opened all the way. Not yet, not even for a husband she was slowly, cautiously, beginning to trust. He did not press her. He simply nodded, as though accepting that some silences deserved the same respect he gave his own. It was, Eleanor thought later, lying awake in her overlarge bed, listening to the house settle around her, the closest thing to true closeness they had shared since the day they married. Not romance, not love, certainly not the kind found in the novels she used to read to Lucy at bedtime, but something quieter, something that felt, strangely, like the beginning of trust. She did not know yet how quickly that trust would be tested. It began on an ordinary Tuesday, with a letter that arrived for Vale from London, the kind of letter that made his footsteps go quick and clipped the moment he read it. He said nothing about its contents at dinner. He excused himself early, disappearing into his study for the rest of the evening, and Eleanor heard no humming at all, not once, not even when he believed himself completely alone. She did not ask him about it. She had learned by now that some things needed to surface on their own, in their own time. What she did not know was that the letter concerned her own brother, Edward, and a debt that had not, in fact, been fully settled the way she had been told. She did not know that a man named Silas Crane, a moneylender with a harsh reputation for collecting what he was owed, through means that had nothing to do with courts or contracts, had begun asking questions in London about the Duke of Merrow's new wife, and about a family debt he believed had not been paid in full. She did not know that her careful, quiet life was about to be shaken loose from its foundations, one letter at a time. For now, she only extinguished her candle, listened to the silence where the humming should have been, and told herself that whatever trouble had arrived, she had survived worse, with far less to protect her. She was not entirely sure that was true, but it was, that night, the only comfort available to her, and Eleanor Finch had never been a woman to refuse whatever comfort she could find. The following morning, Vale left for London without much explanation, taking only a small bag and a grim set to his jaw that Eleanor recognized from the day he had first proposed marriage to her, back when he still believed problems could be solved simply by naming a price and paying it. She stood at the window and watched his carriage disappear down the long drive, the fog closing in behind it, like a curtain falling on a scene she had not been allowed to finish watching. Whatever waited for him in London, she suspected, was about to become her problem too. She was right, though not in the way she expected. 2 days later, while Vale was still away, a man arrived at Merrow House asking for her by her maiden name. Mrs. Doyle turned him away at the door, informing him rather sharply that no woman by that name lived there, only the Duchess of Merrow. The man had smiled, unbothered, and said he would call again. Eleanor watched him leave from an upstairs window, and something cold settled into her stomach, a feeling she recognized from years ago, from the last time a stranger had come looking for her family with that same patient, unhurried confidence. She did not know his name yet. She would learn it soon enough. That night, she wrote a short letter to her brother Edward, the first she had sent him since her wedding day, asking only one question. She wrote it 3 times before she was satisfied with the wording, careful not to alarm him, careful not to reveal how frightened she truly was. "Are the debts fully settled?" she wrote. "Tell me the truth, Edward. I need to know if there is anything still owed, and to whom." She sealed the letter and sent it before she could lose her nerve, and then she sat by the window long into the night, watching the drive for a carriage that did not come, waiting for a husband who did not yet know how badly she needed him home. The fog outside grew thicker as the hours passed, swallowing the gardens, the fountain, the long dark road leading away from the house. Somewhere beyond it, in London, Vale Ashworth was learning things about his wife's family that would change everything between them. And somewhere closer, much closer than Eleanor understood, a man named Silas Crane was already making his plans. The courier came at first light, mud still fresh on his boots, and he would not wait for a reply. Eleanor stood on the cold stone step in her nightclothes, staring at the name written across the front of the letter. It was not her married name. It was the name she had buried 3 years ago, the day she signed away her old life to become the wife of a duke she barely knew. Finch. Just Finch, no title, no Duchess, as though whoever had written it either did not know or did not care what she had become. She did not open it there on the step, where the wind could take it, or where a passing servant might see her hands trembling. She folded it twice, pressed it flat against her chest, and walked back inside before anyone could see her face. Vale had returned from London the evening before, tired and tight-lipped, offering no explanation for his sudden trip beyond a vague mention of business matters that needed his attention. Eleanor had not pressed him. She understood now, with the letter burning against her palm, that she had been giving him the very same silence she was about to ask him to give her. She climbed the stairs to her room and closed the door before she finally broke the seal. The letter was from a solicitor in London, a Mr. Whitfield, writing on behalf of her late mother's estate. Eleanor read the first line twice before the meaning settled into her properly. Her mother had left something behind, not debts, not shame, but money, a sum large enough to change the entire shape of Eleanor's life, held in trust for 3 years, while a dispute over her mother's will was quietly settled between distant relatives who had never once visited while her mother was alive to appreciate their attention. The money was hers. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed and read the letter a 3rd time, and a 4th, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less frightening with enough repetition. They did not. It was not the money itself that frightened her. It was what the money meant, and what it would cost her to claim it honestly. She would need to travel to London. She would need to sign papers under her true name, the name she had not used since her wedding day, the name that belonged to a woman who no longer quite existed. And she would need to do it without her husband learning the full truth of why, because the moment he learned there was money involved, old and painful, he would want to know everything, and everything included Edward. Everything included Silas Crane. Eleanor had not spoken her brother's full troubles aloud to anyone, not even to herself, in nearly a year. She had told Vale only the barest outline on the day of his proposal. What she had not told him was the rest of it, the part that still visited her in dreams some nights, the part she had spent 3 years trying to bury as deeply as she had buried her maiden name. 2 years before her marriage, their mother had fallen gravely ill, and the cost of her care had grown faster than either Eleanor or Edward could manage. Edward, desperate and frightened, and only 20 at the time, had borrowed money from a man in London known for lending to families with nowhere else to turn. Silas Crane did not ask for collateral in the ordinary sense. He asked for promises, and when those promises could not be kept, he collected in whatever manner suited him, patient and unhurried, the way a spider waits for a struggling fly to tire itself out. Their mother had died anyway, despite the money, despite everything, and Edward had been left owing a debt that grew larger every month it went unpaid, a debt that had followed their small family like a shadow that would not lift. Eleanor had believed, truly believed, that her marriage to Vale had settled it. She had seen the accounting herself, checked every figure, every name, but sitting there now with Mr. Whitfield's letter in her lap, she understood, with a cold certainty, that Silas Crane was not a man who simply let a debt disappear because a duke had paid one lump sum to make the trouble quiet. Men like Crane did not deal in debts, they dealt in leverage, and a duchess with a hidden inheritance and a family secret was leverage worth waiting for. She had barely finished folding the letter away when a knock came at her door. "Eleanor." Vale's voice, low and careful. She smoothed her expression before opening the door, though she suspected, from the way his eyes moved over her face, that she had not smoothed it well enough. "A man came to the house while I was in London," he said without preamble. "Mrs. Doyle turned him away. He asked for you by another name." Eleanor's heart dropped, but she kept her voice even. "Many people knew me by another name, before we married." "This man did not ask for the governess," Vale said. "He asked for Miss Finch, specifically, as though he knew exactly who you had been before you became my wife. Mrs. Doyle said he did not seem the sort of man who visits for pleasant reasons." Eleanor said nothing. "I went to London because I received a letter warning me that my wife's family carried an unsettled debt to a moneylender named Silas Crane," Vale continued, watching her face with an intensity that made her want to look away and made her make herself not look away, all at once. "I paid every debt I was shown when we married, every figure, every name. You checked them yourself. Tell me now if there was something left off that accounting, Eleanor. Tell me now, because I would rather hear it from you than from a stranger at my own door." For a long moment, Eleanor considered lying. It would have been easy, in that moment, to say she knew nothing, to protect the careful walls she had built around her old life. But she thought of Lucy asking about her mother at the dinner table, of the way grief hidden away only learned to hide better, never actually disappearing, and she found she could not do to Vale what she had spent years doing to herself. "There is more," she said quietly. "There has always been more. I did not know the full extent of it when we married, or I would have told you. My brother borrowed from Crane before our mother died, more than what you settled. I believed it was finished. I do not believe that any longer." Vale's jaw tightened, but he did not raise his voice, which somehow frightened Eleanor more than shouting would have. "And the letter that came this morning, the one Mrs. Doyle mentioned you received before I woke." Eleanor's hand moved instinctively to the pocket where she had tucked Mr. Whitfield's letter. "That is a separate matter. My mother left me an inheritance. There was a dispute over the will, and it has finally been settled in my favor." "An inheritance," Vale repeated slowly, "and you did not think to mention this to your husband." "I only just read the letter myself," Eleanor said, and heard, even as she said it, how thin the excuse sounded stretched between them. Vale studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor watched something close in his expression, a door she had only just begun to see open now shutting firmly against her. "I see," he said, and it was the coldest thing she had ever heard him say. He left the room without another word, and Eleanor sat alone with two letters, one about money she had never expected, and one about a debt she had never fully escaped, and felt, for the first time since her wedding day, entirely and completely alone. She did not see Vale again until dinner, and even then he spoke only to Lucy, asking about her lessons, her books, her small daily triumphs, in the careful, deliberate tone of a man building a wall out of ordinary conversation. Eleanor answered when spoken to, and said little else, and Lucy, sensitive as always to the temperature of a room, ate her supper in unusual silence, glancing between the two adults with growing worry. That night, Eleanor could not sleep. She lay awake, listening for footsteps in the hall, for humming behind a closed door, for any sign that the careful trust they had built over the past months had not simply shattered in a single afternoon. She heard nothing. The house was as silent as the fog outside, and just as impossible to see through. 3 days passed in that same brittle quiet. Vale spent his days at the tenant farms and his evenings in his study, with the door firmly closed. Eleanor spent hers writing careful letters to Mr. Whitfield, arranging the details of her mother's inheritance, and to Edward, demanding once more the full truth of what he owed and to whom, and receiving in return only vague, apologetic replies that told her nothing useful at all. On the 4th day, a second letter arrived, this one addressed not to Eleanor, but to the Duke of Merrow directly. Eleanor learned of its contents only because Mrs. Doyle, growing increasingly uneasy with the tension gripping the household, quietly warned her that the master had locked himself in his study since receiving it and had not eaten his midday meal. Eleanor found him there that evening, the fire burned down to embers, a single letter open on the desk before him. "What does it say?" she asked, standing in the doorway, unwilling to enter uninvited into a room she had once claimed so easily for her afternoon tea. Vale did not look up. "Silas Crane has written to inform me that your brother's debt was never, in fact, fully settled. That the payment I made 3 months ago covered only a portion of what is owed, the rest concealed from me at the time by a solicitor your brother hired who has since disappeared with the difference." Eleanor's stomach turned to ice. "That cannot be true." "It is precisely true," Vale said, finally looking up at her, his eyes dark with an anger she had never seen directed at her before. "Crane has also learned, somehow, of your recent inheritance, and he suggests, in language careful enough to avoid the appearance of a direct threat, that he would be willing to forget the remaining debt entirely, in exchange for a settlement drawn from your mother's estate. He wants my inheritance," Eleanor said slowly, the full shape of the danger finally becoming clear. "He wants whatever he can take," Vale said, "and he has made it clear that if the debt is not settled his way, he intends to make certain that all of London learns exactly what kind of family the Duchess of Merrow comes from, and exactly how her brother's poor decisions were quietly paid for behind closed doors." Eleanor sank into the chair across from him, her legs suddenly unwilling to hold her upright. "This will ruin Lucy's standing. It will ruin yours." "It will ruin you most of all," Vale said quietly. "And you did not think to warn me any of this was possible." "I did not know," Eleanor said, her voice cracking slightly for the first time since the morning the letter arrived. "I believed it was finished. I wanted so badly for it to be finished that I did not look closely enough at whether it truly was." Vale said nothing for a long moment, staring at the letter on his desk as though it might rearrange itself into something less damaging if he looked at it long enough. "I am going to London tomorrow," he said finally. "I will speak with Crane myself, and I will speak with your brother, and I will find out exactly how deep this trouble runs before it reaches any further into this house." "I am coming with you," Eleanor said immediately. "You are not," Vale said, and there was no room in his voice for argument. "You will stay here with Lucy, where it is safe, while I handle a man who does not deserve to be anywhere near my wife." "He is my family's debt," Eleanor said, standing now, her voice rising for the first time in their entire marriage. "My brother's mistake, my mother's illness, my inheritance he wants to steal. This is not simply your trouble to solve while I wait quietly at home, embroidering something useless." Something in Vale's expression shifted at that, a flicker of the respect she had seen in him on the very first day he proposed, when she had asked which debts, instead of simply accepting his offer. "Fine," he said. "You will come, but you will do exactly as I say, and you will not, under any circumstance, meet with Crane alone." Eleanor agreed, though even as she said the words, she was already turning over private plans of her own, plans that involved Mr. Whitfield's office and her mother's inheritance, and a debt she intended to settle in her own name, on her own terms, without waiting for anyone else, husband or otherwise, to decide how brave she was allowed to be. She did not yet know how close that decision would come to costing her everything. They left for London 2 mornings later, the fog thick and unmoving over the drive, Lucy waving from an upstairs window with a worry in her small face that no amount of gentle reassurance had managed to fully erase. Eleanor waved back, forcing a smile she did not entirely feel, and settled into the carriage beside a husband who sat rigid and silent beside her, his jaw set with the particular tension of a man preparing for a fight he had not chosen but fully intended to win. Neither of them spoke for the first hour of the journey. Eleanor watched the countryside blur past the window, gray fields giving way slowly to the smoke and noise of the approaching city, and thought of Silas Crane waiting somewhere in that noise, patient as ever, certain that a family's fear would eventually deliver him exactly what he wanted. She intended to prove him wrong. "Whatever happens in London," she said finally, breaking the silence, "I need you to know that I did not marry you to hide this from you. I married you because I was frightened, and because you offered a way out, and somewhere along the way, without meaning to, I stopped thinking of this marriage as only an arrangement." Vale turned to look at her, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "I know," he said quietly. "That is precisely why this frightens me as much as it does." He said nothing further, and Eleanor did not press him, but she held on to those 4 words for the rest of the journey, turning them over and over, like a stone worn smooth, a small fragile comfort against whatever waited for them in the fog ahead. London swallowed them whole by late afternoon, the streets crowded and loud, the air thick with coal smoke, and the particular restless energy of a city that never entirely slept. Somewhere within it, a man who had waited 3 years for his moment was already expecting them. The townhouse Vale kept in London had not been opened in months, and the air inside smelled of dust and cold ash. Eleanor barely noticed. Her mind was fixed entirely on the meeting arranged for the following morning, a meeting she did not fully trust her husband to survive without her present. Vale had sent word ahead requesting an audience with Silas Crane, choosing to meet the man directly rather than allow him to circle the family any longer through threatening letters and unannounced visits. Eleanor had agreed to stay behind at the townhouse while he went, though she had agreed the way one agrees to a request one has already decided to ignore. She spent that evening writing to Mr. Whitfield, requesting an urgent meeting the following morning, before Vale's appointment with Crane, and requesting also, in careful, deliberate language, that the solicitor bring with him whatever documents were needed to transfer a portion of her inheritance immediately into her own name and control. She did not tell Vale of this plan. She told herself it was because she did not wish to worry him further. The truth, quieter and harder to admit, was that she wanted, for once, to solve her own family's trouble with her own resources, rather than watch her husband spend yet another fortune cleaning up a mess that had never belonged to him in the first place. She rose before dawn and left the townhouse while Vale still slept, a note left on her pillow explaining only that she had gone to visit the solicitor regarding her inheritance and would return by midday. It was not a lie. It was simply not the whole truth, and Eleanor was beginning to understand, with growing unease, how easily the two could be mistaken for one another when a person wanted badly enough to believe they were protecting someone they loved. Mr. Whitfield's office sat above a bookshop on a narrow London street, and the solicitor himself, a small, precise man with ink permanently staining 2 fingers of his right hand, greeted her with the careful warmth of someone accustomed to delivering both good news and bad in the same steady tone. "Your mother's estate is fully yours to claim, Your Grace," he said, sliding a stack of papers across the desk toward her. "Though I confess, I am surprised to see you arrive without the Duke." "This is a matter I wish to handle personally," Eleanor said, taking up the pen he offered. She was halfway through signing the 3rd document when the office door opened without a knock, and a man stepped inside who Eleanor recognized instantly, though she had never once met him, simply from the cold, patient way his eyes moved over the room before settling on her. Silas Crane was not a large man, nor a particularly frightening one to look at. He wore a well-tailored coat and carried himself with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted. That, Eleanor understood immediately, was precisely what made him dangerous. "Mrs. Finch," he said, using her maiden name with deliberate emphasis, ignoring the title she now carried. "Or should I say, Your Grace? Forgive the intrusion. I had business with Mr. Whitfield myself this morning, and I confess I did not expect the pleasure of finding you here as well." Eleanor set down her pen very carefully. "This is a private appointment, Mr. Crane." "Of course," he said, though he did not leave. He settled instead into the chair beside her, uninvited, his eyes drifting to the papers spread across the desk. "Your mother's inheritance, I presume? A considerable sum, I understand. Enough, certainly, to settle a family debt several times over." "The Duke has already settled my brother's debt," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the cold fear climbing her spine. "The Duke settled a debt," Crane said pleasantly. "Not the debt. There is a distinction, and I believe your brother's solicitor was careful to ensure that distinction remained unclear until it suited someone's purposes to reveal it." Eleanor's hands curled into fists beneath the desk, out of sight. "What do you want, Mr. Crane?" "I want what I am owed," he said simply. "And I am a patient man, Your Grace, but patience has its limits, particularly when a woman with a fresh inheritance sits so conveniently close by, signing away her fortune to solicitors instead of to the men who actually kept her family afloat when no duke was yet willing to marry her." Mr. Whitfield, alarmed now, half rose from his seat. "Sir, I must ask you to leave. This is a private matter between myself and my client." "It is entirely a private matter," Crane agreed, still smiling, still unhurried. "Which is precisely why I suggest we settle it privately, before it becomes something far less pleasant for everyone involved. A carriage waits outside, Your Grace. I would very much appreciate a short conversation, away from prying clerks and interrupted appointments." Eleanor's heart pounded, but she kept her expression carefully still, the same expression she had once used to face down unruly students and unreasonable parents alike. "I have no intention of leaving this office with you, Mr. Crane." Something shifted in his face then, the pleasant mask slipping just enough to reveal the patient, calculating thing beneath it. "I had hoped this would not require unpleasantness," he said, "but I find myself with little choice." He moved faster than Eleanor expected for a man of his unhurried manner, closing the distance between them and gripping her arm with a strength that made her gasp. Mr. Whitfield shouted for the clerk downstairs, but Crane had already begun pulling Eleanor toward the door, his voice low and urgent now, all pretense of pleasantness gone. "You will come with me quietly," he said, "or your brother's debt will be the least of your husband's troubles by the time this week is finished." Eleanor twisted against his grip, years of quiet composure, giving way to something fiercer, something that had been waiting a long time for permission to fight back. She drove her heel down hard against his foot, and when his grip loosened for just a moment in surprise, she pulled free and threw herself toward the window, shouting for the street below. It was not her scream that saved her. It was the sound of the office door slamming open, and her husband's voice, sharp and furious, filling the small room like a thunderclap. "Get away from my wife." Vale had woken to find her note, and something in its careful wording, the whole truth left just slightly unfinished, had sent him racing across London the moment he realized where she had truly gone. He crossed the room in 3 strides and struck Crane hard enough to send the smaller man stumbling into the bookshelf, papers scattering across the floor in a chaotic storm. "You will not touch her again," Vale said, his voice low and dangerous in a way Eleanor had never heard from him before. "You will not come near my wife, my daughter, or my house ever again, or I will see to it personally that every debt you have ever collected through fear and threats is exposed to every magistrate in London." Crane straightened slowly, blood at the corner of his mouth, his composure cracking for the first time since he had entered the room. "You cannot simply erase a debt with threats, Your Grace." "I am not erasing a debt," Vale said. "I am erasing you. Every man who has ever borrowed from you out of desperation will find, within the week, that their debts have been quietly purchased and forgiven by someone with far deeper pockets and far less patience for cruelty than you have ever shown them. You will have nothing left to threaten anyone with, Crane. Not my wife's inheritance, not her brother's mistakes, nothing." For a long moment, Crane said nothing at all, calculating, perhaps for the first time in years, that he had finally met someone with both the resources and the will to dismantle everything he had built on the fear of frightened families. "This is not finished," he said finally, straightening his coat with as much dignity as he could gather. "It is finished," Vale said. "You simply have not yet realized it." Crane left without another word, and the small office fell into a stunned, ringing silence, broken only by Mr. Whitfield quietly gathering the scattered papers from the floor. Eleanor stood frozen by the window, her arm throbbing where Crane's grip had bruised it, her whole body shaking now that the danger had passed. Vale turned to her immediately, his anger dissolving into something far more raw and unguarded. "You left without me," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You left a note that told me almost nothing, and I nearly did not reach you in time." "I wanted to solve this myself," Eleanor said, her voice unsteady. "I wanted, for once, to fix my family's trouble without asking you to spend yet another fortune protecting me from mistakes that were never yours to begin with." "They became mine the day I married you," Vale said, closing the distance between them and taking her bruised arm gently in his hands, examining it with a tenderness that made Eleanor's breath catch. "Everything that frightens you frightens me now, Eleanor. That is what this marriage became, somewhere between the ledger of debts and the accounting of shillings. I did not plan for it. I do not know exactly when it happened, but it happened, and I nearly lost you to a man who has spent years profiting from other people's desperation, because you did not think to trust me with the whole truth." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she had been holding back for what felt like years, not simply since the morning the letter arrived, but since the day her mother died, since the day Edward first confessed his debts, since every moment she had spent believing that carrying her fears alone was somehow safer than sharing the weight of them with someone else. "I am not accustomed to being protected," she said quietly. "I have spent my whole life being the one who protects others." "Then let this be the beginning of something new," Vale said. "Let me carry some of it, Eleanor. Not because you are incapable, because you should not have to carry everything alone simply because you have always been strong enough to." Mr. Whitfield cleared his throat gently from across the room, holding out the remaining documents with the careful discretion of a man who understood exactly when to make himself invisible. "Shall we finish the signing, Your Grace, or would you prefer to return another day?" Eleanor took a steadying breath and reached for the pen. "We will finish it now," she said. "All of it. No more secrets left unsigned." She completed the transfer of her inheritance with Vale standing quietly beside her, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, not directing her, simply present, the way a person stands beside someone they have decided, finally and completely, not to let carry anything alone again. It was not until they were back in the carriage, London's noise and smoke fading slowly behind them, that Eleanor allowed herself to finally break down, the fear of the morning catching up to her all at once, her whole body trembling with the release of it. Vale pulled her against him without a word, and she let him, resting her head against his shoulder as the carriage rattled along, and for the first time since the wedding chapel with its 4 witnesses and forgotten vows, Eleanor Finch allowed herself to feel, fully and without reservation, that she was no longer entirely alone in the world. But Silas Crane's parting words echoed in her mind even as the fear began to ease. "This is not finished," he had said, and something in the certainty of his voice told her he had meant it as more than simple wounded pride. She did not yet know that he would try one final time to take by force what he could no longer take by threats, or that the next attempt would happen not in the safety of a London office, but on a quiet country road, far from any help, where a duke's title would mean nothing at all against a man with nothing left to lose. They left London 2 days later than planned, delayed by the business of quietly buying up every debt Silas Crane held over other frightened families, a task Vale pursued with a grim thoroughness that left 3 separate solicitors working through the night to finish the paperwork. By the time they finally climbed into the carriage for the journey home, Eleanor believed, cautiously, that the worst of it had passed. She was wrong. The road to Merrow House wound through open country for the better part of a day, fields giving way to forest and back again, the fog from the estate seeming to follow them the closer they came to home. They were no more than 2 hours from the house when the carriage lurched suddenly, throwing Eleanor hard against the seat, the driver shouting something lost in the sudden confusion of hooves and raised voices outside. "Stay down," Vale said sharply, already reaching for the small pistol he kept in the carriage door, his easy calm from the morning gone entirely, replaced by something focused and alert. Eleanor's heart slammed against her ribs. Through the small window, she caught a glimpse of 3 men on horseback, faces half covered, blocking the narrow road ahead. A 4th man dismounted near the driver, and Eleanor recognized, even at a distance, the unhurried, patient way he moved. Silas Crane had not given up. He had simply changed his approach. He said he would not touch her again, Eleanor whispered, more to herself than to Vale, disbelief and fury tangling together in her chest. He lied, Vale said grimly. Men like Crane always do, the moment they believe they have nothing left to lose. The carriage door was wrenched open before either of them could plan further, and one of the masked men reached inside, grabbing for Eleanor's arm. She did not freeze this time. She drove her elbow hard into his face, exactly as she had done in Mr. Whitfield's office, and the man staggered back with a shout of pain, giving Vale just enough room to fire a single warning shot into the air above the horses. The animals reared, screaming, and chaos broke out on the narrow road, men shouting, horses bolting, the driver fighting to keep the carriage steady on the uneven ground. Eleanor scrambled out the far door, refusing to sit trapped inside while her husband fought alone, and found herself face to face with Silas Crane himself, standing calm and unbothered in the middle of the chaos, as though the shouting and the gunfire belonged to some other scene entirely. "You should not have come out here alone, Your Grace," he said, and there was no pleasantness left in his voice now, only cold calculation. "This would have been so much simpler if your husband had understood the first time that some debts are never truly finished." "You bought debts from desperate families," Eleanor said, backing carefully away from him, searching for anything within reach that might serve as a weapon. "My husband bought them all back. There is nothing left for you to threaten anyone with, Mr. Crane. You have already lost." "I have lost money," Crane said, advancing slowly. "I have not yet lost the satisfaction of proving that a duke's title cannot protect what matters most to him." He lunged for her then, and Eleanor twisted away, her hand closing around a heavy iron lantern hook hanging from the side of the carriage. She swung it hard, catching him across the shoulder, and he staggered with a furious shout, giving her just enough time to scramble toward the trees at the edge of the road. Behind her, she heard Vale's voice roaring her name, heard the sharp crack of another gunshot, heard the sound of hooves finally retreating as the other masked men, seeing their leader struck and their advantage lost, chose their own safety over their employer's grudge. Crane recovered quickly, seizing her by the back of her cloak just as she reached the tree line, and Eleanor spun, driving the lantern hook forward with every bit of strength 3 years of quiet composure had been holding in reserve. It struck him solidly across the temple, and this time he did not simply stagger. He dropped. Silence fell over the road, broken only by Eleanor's ragged breathing and the distant, frightened whinny of the horses settling. Vale reached her seconds later, pulling her against him with a desperation that told her exactly how close he had believed he had come to losing her. "Eleanor, Eleanor, look at me. Are you hurt?" "I am not hurt," she said, though her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the lantern hook, still clutched in her fingers. "I am not hurt, Vale." He held her for a long moment, both of them breathing hard, the fallen figure of Silas Crane lying motionless a few feet away, before the driver, bruised but unharmed, hurried over to bind the man's wrists with a length of rope from the carriage box, muttering darkly about magistrates and constables the entire time. They delivered Silas Crane to the local magistrate before nightfall, along with a full account of his threats, his attempted abduction, and the careful documentation Mr. Whitfield had already prepared regarding every debt the man had ever collected through fear rather than honest lending. It was enough, the magistrate assured them grimly, to see Crane answer for far more than a single afternoon's violence on a country road. By the time they finally reached Merrow House, the fog had lifted for the first time in weeks, revealing a clear, cold evening sky scattered with stars. Lucy ran to meet them at the door, flinging herself first at her father and then at Eleanor, her small arms wrapping tight around Eleanor's waist with a fierceness that nearly undid every last careful wall Eleanor had left standing. "You were gone so long," Lucy said, her voice muffled against Eleanor's cloak. "I was frightened." "We are home now," Eleanor said, kneeling to meet the girl properly, ignoring the ache in her bruised arm. "And we are not going anywhere again for a very long while." That night, once Lucy had finally been settled to sleep, after a full accounting of the journey, carefully edited for anything too frightening, Eleanor found Vale in his study, the fire burning steadily, no letters waiting on his desk for once, nothing urgent left to solve. "You should not have come out of the carriage," he said quietly, without looking up from the fire. "I have thought of little else the entire ride home. What might have happened if you had not reached for that lantern hook quickly enough? I could not simply sit inside and wait to learn whether you had survived," Eleanor said, settling into the chair across from him, the one she had claimed for her afternoon tea so many months ago. "I have spent my whole life being the one who waits quietly while other people's troubles are decided around her. I did not marry a duke to continue doing that." Something in his expression softened at that, the last of the day's tension finally loosening from his shoulders. "No," he agreed. "I do not suppose you did." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, before he spoke again, his voice lower now, more uncertain than Eleanor had ever heard it. "I did not marry you for love, Eleanor. I want you to know that I understood that clearly. The day I stood in your schoolroom and asked which debts, as though love had nothing at all to do with what I was offering you." "I know," Eleanor said softly. "I did not expect to find it anyway," he continued. "Not in a marriage built on a ledger of unpaid shillings. Not with a woman who checked every figure before she would agree to marry me, who asked which debts instead of simply accepting whatever I offered. But I have watched you these past months, Eleanor, teaching my daughter, claiming my study for your afternoon tea, checking every account twice because you refuse to trust anything you have not verified yourself. And somewhere in all of that, without any intention of allowing it, I fell in love with my own wife." Eleanor's breath caught, the fire crackling softly in the silence that followed his words. "I was so afraid," she said finally, her voice unsteady, "that admitting how much I had come to feel for you would somehow undo the careful arrangement we built. That if I said it aloud, it would become something fragile enough to lose, the way everything else in my life has been lost eventually. My mother, my family's safety, the name I used to answer to." "You have not lost me," Vale said, rising from his chair and crossing the small distance between them, kneeling before her the way he had never once done, not even on their wedding day. "You will not lose me, Eleanor. Not to Silas Crane, not to old debts, not to anything else this world tries to throw between us. I love you, plainly, entirely, without a single condition attached to it." Eleanor felt the tears she had been holding back finally spill over, not from fear this time, but from something warmer, something that had been waiting a long time for permission to exist fully. "I love you as well," she said. "I have loved you for longer than I was willing to admit, even to myself. Somewhere between the debts and the ledgers and the quiet afternoons in your study, I stopped thinking of this marriage as an arrangement and started thinking of it as my life, my real one." Vale reached up and gently wiped the tears from her cheek, his hand lingering against her face with a tenderness that held none of the careful distance from their wedding day. "Then let it be exactly that," he said. "Your real life, mine as well. No more ledgers standing between us." He kissed her then, softly, carefully, as though she were something precious rather than something purchased, and Eleanor, who had spent so many years being strong for everyone else, finally allowed herself to simply be loved. Silas Crane stood trial 3 months later and was sentenced to a long term in prison for his crimes, his network of fear finally and permanently dismantled. Edward, humbled and deeply ashamed, wrote Eleanor a long letter of apology, and she forgave him, slowly, the way one forgives family, imperfectly but completely. Merrow House filled, in the years that followed, with a warmth it had not known in a very long time. Lucy grew tall and clever, insisting always that her stepmother's lessons were far more interesting than any tutor's had ever been. And in the study where Eleanor had once claimed the best afternoon light for herself, a second chair now sat permanently beside the first, and in the quiet hours between duties, a duke could sometimes be heard humming 4 familiar notes, no longer stopping the moment he remembered he was not alone, because he no longer needed to hide the sound from the woman sitting beside him, the one he had married for convenience, and had come, against every careful calculation either of them had ever made, to love completely.